Hello, welcome to Graphic Policy Radio. This is your host, Ilana Levin. This is a comics podcast, usually. But like everyone else, we're watching Game of Thrones, and I wanted to have two of the biggest A Song of Ice and Fire experts around to talk about it with us, each from a really unique perspective. I'm really excited and honored to be able to bring these two voices to the show, because when I was thinking about, like, who do I want to have a Game of Thrones podcast with that isn't on a Game of Thrones podcast now, these were the two games that came to mind immediately. So you are all in for a treat. Joining me is frequent guest of the show. Stephen Attewell is the founder of Race for the Iron Throne, which covers A Song of Ice and Fire chapter by chapter from a historical and political angle. In addition to two published collections of the chapter by chapter essays, Stephen is also author of Kings, Hands, and City-States, a collection of essays focusing specifically on the political structures of George R.R. Martin's world. He is on Twitter at Stephen Attewell, StevenAttewell, and Tumblr as Race for the Iron Throne, where I see people asking him a billion questions at all times. Hello, Stephen.
Hello, good to be here.
And joining me for the first time is Reuben Tihi Hayslett. Tihi is a queer activist, writer, and storyteller. He currently works at Demand Progress, leading online campaigns against the overreach of government surveillance. Tihi's debut book, Dark Corners, is a short story collection of speculative fiction that centers the voices of queer people of color. You can find Dark Corners wherever you buy books online or in person. As a fluent speaker of Dothraki, one of the languages created for HBO's Game of Thrones, Tihi recently worked on the upcoming Netflix series Daybreak as a Dothraki Language Consultant. Tihi has an MFA in creative writing from Fairfield University and currently lives in Long Beach, California. Hello.
Hey, hi everyone, I'm happy to be here.
That's awesome.
Very well done.
I just love that you were like, I am going to learn Dothraki, and then you did that.
It's really been like the life-changing kind of hobby. I had no idea what I was getting into when I got started with it. And now I'm like in this crazy place of like developing like Dothraki divination and astrology systems and whatnot, and might be having my own book out about that soon. I have to find out.
That's great.
If folks want to get more involved in the Dothraki speaking language community or Dothraki learning language community, where would they do that?
A really great place to go is Discord. If you have the Discord app, if you're a gamer, we have our own server. It's invite only. It's Rahashi Dothraki Country. You can also follow us on Twitter at Rahash Dothraki, which is the main Twitter page for our Dothraki community.
That's awesome. Can you spell that real quick? That's spelled R-H-A-E-S-H. Dothraki, D-O-T-H-R-A-K-I. Again, R-H-A-E-S-H. Dothraki.
Hi.
So as you can see, listeners, we are coming to this from a very nerdy place. I don't know if I've spoken about my associations with the show or the books on the podcast before. I would say that I was someone who got sucked into reading the books right before the series began. I just read them all in a giant binge of reading, and then as soon as the new one came out, I read it, and I read the prequels. I consider myself to be very versed in the world of Song of Ice and Fire, but I'm not the expert. But I really love the books, and I enjoy the show. That's how I would describe my fandom with it. And I haven't really done a Game of Thrones coverage before because this is basically a comics podcast. But this was just too good of an opportunity to not do. And last night we all got to watch the premiere of the final season of the show. I have had a range of feelings around the show, in different seasons at different points. At this point, I was happy with the way the last season ended, despite there have been plenty of things I had issues with before that in the season. But I remained, pretty hopeful and excited to see what would happen. I am one of those folks who feel like I thought that the show was consistently better before it outpaced the material it was based on. I don't blame them for having to do this. They had no choice. But I do really believe that the literary and artistic vision of George R.R. Martin is brilliant and complex and sensitive in a way that it's hard to sometimes transfer onto television. But I still enjoy the show. I'm still happy to be here.
I agree. I just started reading the books now, but I feel like as somebody who watched the show without reading any of the books, you can kind of tell when the show started to outpace George R. R. Martin.
Yeah.
Yeah. See, that's interesting to me to hear as well. I've heard that from a lot of folks who were show first folks. And one of the things that I really hope that folks get from this season, a friend of mine is actually going to be launching a campaign around A Song of Ice and around Game of Thrones, connecting it to the elections in the EU parliamentary elections. And I was just voicing to him that I thought it was kind of cool that they were going to be starting their campaign near the end of the series, because I hope by then people will be more aware of the fact that this is a show that's not just about twists and turns and psyching people out. It's about like serious subject matter like climate change and abuse and like regime change and what that looks like. So hopefully by the end that will be an undeniable thing that everyone watching it will have realized, and that could be maybe useful for his campaign. But we shall see.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Sometimes, especially in more recent years as well, I've felt that the show has really kind of uncritically accepted the Lannister assertion that in the Game of Thrones, there's you win or you die, and the only thing that matters are the ends, not the means. Whereas, I highly encourage anyone who's a fan of the show to read the books, where I think there's a very interesting critique and interrogation of that kind of consequentialist philosophy, as well as sort of a critique of sort of your standard fantasy series in which, good people prevail because they are good people.
Yeah.
And I'd also just say, as a comics reader, like, I have never read anything as propulsive or addictive as these books.
That's good to hear, because I'm somewhat struggling with the first book, but I feel like I'm also approaching it as like a Dothraki speaker, where like if the Dothraki aren't in the scenes, I don't really care because I've seen it all, which is just my own failings. I think one of the things that the show has is this underlying assumption around like power and who deserves to have power. Like, I'm really interested in how the final season is going to wrap this up with Daenerys' claim to the throne, Jon's claim to the throne, and it's kind of like it's the underlying assumption there that there is always a claim to the throne, that some minority always has claim to power in some way. And like all the various different cultures in the Song of Ice and Fire have these sort of like power hierarchies. And I'm wondering like how we're gonna leave all of this. Are we gonna get a revolution, or are we gonna get like a mini like half-step revolution that happened in Slaver's Bay when Daenerys sort of like led the revolt, but not very many things have changed, and that we also haven't gone back and seen since she left. Like, it's kind of an afterthought. So it's like, I felt really weird about that during those seasons.
Yeah.
I was going to say, like, the thing that I've sometimes been worried about is that there is something of an attitude that in order to be good, you have to be stupid, and in order to be smart, you have to be a little bit evil. You sort of saw this a little bit like last season, where, like, Jon Snow goes out of his way to be, like, ridiculously truthful, even when that's going to do a huge amount of damage to his own side. And, vice versa, like, I don't know, I feel like a little bit of the conflict with him and Sansa is this idea that, like, if you're smart and politically minded, then that means that you're also, manipulative, and, I was reading one recap where they sort of were talking about this idea that, like, the only people that you can trust with power are the ones who don't want it, which, is an attitude that I'm a little uncomfortable about, because, in some ways, like, I do believe that, like, being a politician is a profession, and a skilled profession, and it's one that, like, you kind of want people to want to be good at and succeed at, and often reluctant rulers can be rightfully reluctant because they're not very good at it.
And I mean, I feel like we saw that with the High Sparrow thing too. He like protests so much that he was, just a commoner and he didn't want any of this power. and then, took over and tried to install this theocracy. I think that we in the Western world have this sense that any kind of political intelligence, any kind of understanding of power and resources and dynamics are inherently evil. And I say that as somebody who's worked as a political operative a lot of times, like wondering if I'm evil for being savvy and seeing like, oh, here's an opening where we could, run a campaign that could have like a big effect. Like, wow, does that make me conniving? Like, I don't know. I worry about this.
No, people treat us that way. I remember one time I was on jury duty, and they went and they asked us like what our careers were. And when they came to me, they were like, "Are you okay with us telling the others what you do for a living?" And I was like, "Good God, I don't like kidnap children, or like I'm not like a drug dealer. Like what even?" I was like, "Yes, please tell them, and then I can help them figure out where their polling place is. Like, fuck you." But yeah, that's a real dynamic, and I'm glad you're all pointing to it. I'm also impressed. We've gotten to be like, how many minutes? Like 10 into our episode, and we've had no spoilers. So I do want to say to our folks, if you were someone who was questioning if watching the new season is even worth doing it, like, yes, of course, finish the damn thing. Good God. The only person who I know who's actually like dropped out and said nope, goodbye was my spouse after the Battle of the Bastards decided to nope out of watching the rest of the series. But other than him, everybody else, like, come on, we're gonna watch this, and from here on out, here be spoilers of the first episode of season 8.
Yes.
Thank you.
Which, by the way, turns out actually does have an episode title.
I
was trying like hell. It's Winterfell. It's very simple. But like, I was trying like hell ahead of the show to like, okay, what do I call this episode when I write the post? But yes, they actually have episode titles.
Because on HBO Now, when it just popped up, like, and it had the episode title, but I've seen people online being like, oh, what is this episode called? And I'm like, Winterfell? Like, but not everybody is using, I guess, my streaming things, which is not a plug. All telecom companies are evil.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, there's no ethical consumption under capitalism.
Exactly.
So let's talk about the new credit sequence, which I was so excited. It was beautiful to get like really taken inside of the buildings for the first time.
Yeah, and what I especially liked about it was that, like, it paid homage to the style that we've come to expect from the show, but then did very different things. Like, for me, seeing the wall and then it being cracked and seeing that, like, blue ice tiles spreading really, made the White Walkers feel very real. But also, I think it did a great job at, like, bringing various, really centering Winterfell and, like, bringing the locations within Winterfell, like the crypts, and that's an important location, or the heart tree, and that's an important location, really to the fore in a way that sort of, a simple rotating cog doesn't always quite do.
Yeah, I was a little disappointed with it, partially because, like, I understand why they're doing it and showing all of this and the crypts and the throne room and everything, they were exciting, but because the show's coming to a close, there's less places they're going. Yeah. And so there's more time to show more of that. And that was the first time, even in the opening credits, the first time it hits me that, like, this phenomena is going to end because all these stories are converging in the north. And I'm like, oh, I'm never going to see Vias Dothrak on this map ever again, most likely. Yeah. And that makes me sad. In places like Bravos, which I always thought were super interesting, or Dorne, which I feel like is the best place to be in Westeros, but
No, that's all very true. I mean, we're at a point where people with specific kinds of priorities in what they love about the show or series will have less for them, depending on what it is that they're looking for. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I was really impressed with at the beginning of the series was how much the opening sequence mirrored the first sequences from from season 1 with the royal family arriving at Winterfell when everyone was young and naive. And this episode, instead of having Bran running along trying to find a good angle and Arya running around, we have the new little boy who we later find out is probably the smallest of small John Umbers. I feel so terrible for the Umbers. They were like, I really liked them in the books. And Anyway, he's like, little boy running, trying to get a good angle on the procession as it arrives, and Arya getting out of the way for him to have a better view. It's just a complete throwback to that first sequence, but showing her, as a more adult character now, and with a new generation of little kid running behind.
Yeah.
It was really cute. It's also it's I feel like you could see in that scene like so much trauma that Arya has gone through, like through so many seasons where like Arya's a fighter, and like Arya, but she really kind of slips into the dark side for a while. And I feel like late last season and all throughout this episode, you kind of see her somewhat wrestle with that. So like when she sees Jon Snow and she's really happy to see him, but then there's Daenerys there, and then the Hound comes, but then Gendry's there. And it's like, as much as she wants to be hardened into this well-trained assassin, she is still kind of a teenager, and she still has these like emotional sorts of reactions, which I thought were like excellently played by the actor. She did an amazing job. The whole cast is very talented, but it was one of the things I really enjoyed.
And following up on that idea of the mirroring, one of the things that I like, the positive thing in this first episode, I feel overwhelmingly, is that like these reunions that fans have been waiting for years and years and years. In some cases, like literally like season 1, episode 1 to now, towards the very end of the episode, are finally happening. And that's great. And I really like that. And we get to see all these sort of new character combinations that we haven't seen in the past. The downside to that, the price that you pay for that a little bit, is that like you lost a little bit of the narrative propulsion. Like not a whole lot happened. The thing that was sort of crazy to me is this episode represented like 16% of the whole season.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't have a lot of narrative room to run, but they still devoted 16% to like this. In some ways, like, it reminds me of premiere episodes of previous seasons, which were always a little bit slow, and then everything would pick up as you got, more towards, like, episode 3 or 4.
Yeah, I was telling friends earlier today about this when we were, like, debriefing the show, that, like, we need these reunions. We need to see how people's tensions butt up against each other, because a lot of people are actually fighting on the same side, which is the side of life and humans and fighting against the army of the dead. But just because they're on the same side doesn't mean that they agree about everything or that they can't have beef with each other. And like that will make the future battle much more narratively rich once we see and can kind of understand that there are so many different dynamics at play here and different shifting kind of feelings of loyalty and guilt. Like I'm thinking about like Tyrion and Sansa and like there's sort of like cold forgiveness / thing that happened in their reunion, and that these things are, while it's not a lot of plot happening, they're so necessary for where we're gonna go, that I was like forgiving the show for being a little bit slow. Although everybody's shade was hella thick, the tea was piping hot on like literally every single character. Read everyone for filth in this episode, which was great, and I was hooting and hollering the whole time.
So, one of the things that was different between this procession of kings and queens into Winterfell versus season 1's is this time there are black people. And I really appreciated Black Twitter's responses to, like, seeing the Northerners looking at Grey Worm and Missandei coming in on the horses, like clearly as people in stations of power, within the arrival of the court, so to speak, and just trying to read people's faces and see what that is like. I mean, because you have a cosmopolitan country in other parts of the country. King's Landing, you've got a lot more racial diversity, but in the North, you really haven't seen that.
And what I thought was really interesting, so like The Root all last season had these amazing, hilarious analysis and breakdowns from like a black perspective on Game of Thrones, which I enjoyed to read, but also as a black person, I was like, I don't always like see or agree with them. But one of them is this assertion that like the Starks are like white cousins of us black folk, and I was like, I never quite really like believed that, even though it's a hilarious assertion. But we can see it in the North with just like, it was so, to me as a person of color, obvious, like when Missandei looks and she looks at, you know, this like poor family on the side of the road and the way they're staring at her. It's like, of course the North is racist. They're like isolated, they're culturally isolated, they're really into their own identity and their own sort of isolated histories and traditions, and that's to me kind of like one of the tent poles of conservatism is like, we are separate, we are different, we have this tradition that is distinct and superior from other people's. That I was like, yeah, it was like a reminder that like, you know, the white folks in Westeros are not going to save us, and they're not really loyal. That after we get rid of the Night King, there's still going to be a lot of things to deal with, especially like from a Dothraki perspective.
Yeah, that was one of the things there where the camera work was raised a thought to me, which is like, okay, this like army that is like visually invading the scene, you know, that is sort of shown as like this incredibly monolithic, you know, efficient clockwork thing, is an army of people of color marching into the North. And that like colors some of the like conflict later on about like, you know, between the sort of quote unquote northern loyalists and the sort of Dany's contingent. But you know, I think, and it's we didn't really see like much in the way of Dothraki, unless I missed it.
We weren't very present this episode. And then, like, we kind of haven't been since Daenerys, like, burned down the Dosh Khaleen with all the calls in there and just sort of took over all of the Dothraki people. We've kind of been, I'm not a Dothraki person, but Dothrakis have kind of been relegated to the side, which has been really unfortunate because I think, like, of all the cultures that we see in A Song of Ice and Fire, some of the people who have the most vested stake in, like, whatever outcome of who's going to be on the Iron Throne now are actually the Dothraki people. So, like, a whole bunch of them, if not all of them, abandoned their very expansive territory in Essos to come across to Westeros, and crossing the ocean is so taboo. So, like, will they make that second taboo journey back home? And what's going to be left of their home when they get back there? Like, that's going to create this huge power vacuum dynamic that other people are going to encroach in because they had to kill everybody who lived there just to have that as their territory. So hopefully some Dothraki stayed behind, but if so, they're in a weaker position. And if the Dothraki decide not to go back, what's going to happen to them? They're like stateless people now because they're not from Westeros. They don't have any of the same sort of like cultural infrastructure to help them survive in Westeros. Like the Dothraki people don't understand capitalism or mercantilism. They don't have a word for money. They don't care about that. They just sort of like pillage and take or have like a gift-giving economy. They don't necessarily stay in one place unless that place is Vias Dothrak, which is now an ocean away. So it's like, how are the Dothraki going to handle Westeros, and how is Westeros going to handle the Dothraki? Which is like my burning question that I'm asking myself watching this whole season that I hope gets answered, but I'm actually like very worried about the state of Dothraki people.
I think it's a huge question, and that I agree that there's a good chance that they won't actually give it a satisfying resolution. I mean, we saw her talking to a couple of Dothraki warriors. Like, there was like a brief exchange, basically.
Yep. And there was, as a Dothraki speaker, I was just talking to David J. Peterson about this earlier today, but like a little bit of an error in the captioning. So Daenerys is asking like, how much things have the dragons eaten? And they report back like, oh, this much and this much. What they're saying actually in Dothraki is actually a lot less food. They say like, Akati Dorve Sen Vaf, which is like 12 goats and 3 sheep. But the English subtitles said like 11 goats and 18 sheep. That like in the editing, the editors decided that the original line of dialogue wasn't enough food, so they just like changed the caption as opposed to changing the whole audio and the whole Dothraki.
Wow, so they didn't do like ADR or anything?
No, yeah.
Ah.
Which is interesting. And, like, also because the dragons are eating a lot of food, and they don't have a lot of food in the north now, especially now that this army is here. So, like, it kind of ratchets up the tension.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Sansa raising the point about, like, supplies. I think that how do we keep this army fed in the part of the country that has the least food to start with is a serious concern. I don't know what to do about that.
I mean, part of me thinks that, like, well, there's an open question about, how long are any of these people going to be around to eat anything? It's a real concern, but, like, I gotta think that, like, the upcoming casualty rate is going to be pretty damn high.
Yep. And things like, well, they have some grains and stuff in storage, but, like, are there going to have to then be, like, missions of people who go south of Winterfell to, like, collect more food and grain and ship it back up? Which is probably something that, like, elderly people and children could do who are, like, not yet fighting age.
Yeah, I mean, and they definitely, like, point to and acknowledge, like, Sansa as being, like, a logistics type person who, like, keeps her eye on the logistics of situations. And sort of honor her for that. I love this. The Sansa Tyrion reunion was really interesting. I mean, the line, "Many underestimated you, most of them are dead now," is just, like, amazing. And yet she doesn't explain to him, oh, by the way, I didn't actually kill your nephew knowingly.
Yeah.
They still couldn't actually speak the truth to each other, really.
Yeah, it was kind of... something I noticed about the dialogue in this episode is it seemed very reverse engineered in a lot of places. That, like, they came up with the comeback or, like, the snappy line that would end the conversation, and then felt like to me that they'd then worked their way back to, like, how does the conversation start? Because I was thinking in that exchange, like, oh, like, this is all set up so that when they find out the truth about Cersei next episode, that, like, she gets to, like, snap at Tyrion for, I gotta say, like, for a character whose whole thing is, like, he's intelligent, the showrunners have been putting him almost universally in the wrong for about a season and a half now.
Yeah.
And I'm like, this is a problem, because if your whole thing about your character is you're intelligent, like, you can tell that to the audience, but, like, unless you start showing it, you create a little bit of dissonance.
Yeah, I think that, like, Tyrion's peak level of intelligence and, like, maneuvering and political understanding really only kind of exists in King's Landing, and that, like, once he was taken out, he's, like, so out of his element that it's almost surprising. It's like his reputation is why he's Hand of the King, but, like, he doesn't really have, like, you're right, he hasn't had, like, good advice or been a great advisor to Daenerys, sort of in his tenure there, but he would be sort of necessary in King's Landing if/when she wins, that he's an important person. But yeah, it's like Tyrion's sort of intellectual powers are completely confined within a sort of urban, politically rich and politically complex environment, and that if he's not in that, he's not very much use.
That definitely makes sense. Like, I hate when so much literature acts as if there's only one kind of intelligence to be had. And as a person who's very smart about some things and very dumb about others, I've always resented that, and it's also just literally not true. So the idea that Tyrion, in certain social contexts in which he is bringing a lot of world knowledge to bear, knows what's up, and outside of them is beyond, is accurate as hell, and better writing than a lot of things.
Yeah, I agree with Steven that I don't think that the showrunners are actually saying that. Like, I think that they're trying to pack a lot of story into a small amount of space, and that's one way of looking at it, but they're not necessarily very obvious about it. Which is also going to be interesting, because I agree with your point that it seemed like a lot of the dialogue was constructed for these wig-snatching, witty comebacks. And now that I think about it, I'm like, oh man, that's almost a little disappointing.
I'm sorry.
But you're totally right. So they need to up their game.
One section that was a very well constructed I thought from a directorial standpoint, horror sequence that ended with a quippy line, which is the horror movie sequence we had. It was a straight up, and now the episode will become a horror movie, where we have Dolorous Ed and his crew of Night's Watchmen, and running into Tormund Giantsbane and his crew, Scooby-Doo style. We were coming from the other side of the haunted house. Oh, good, you're just you human. I've always had blue eyes. But then it dials back and you see, actually, there's also that poor little boy from the beginning of the episode, the smallest of the small jaw numbers, I refer to him, dead on a spike, fully ice zombied, and with a radiating wheel of limbs of other people coming out of his body. I've been trying to think about the symbolism of that sort of sun pattern and what it means, because the thing is, normally that kind of design is a sun pattern, but these are the ice zombies making it.
So that spiral pattern has shown up in the show before. They did it at the Fist of the First Men with all the horses. It showed up in the cave with Jon and Daenerys. It is notably not the symbol from the pilot, but I think this is one of those things that they came up with later, and is a little bit fancier and more complex than the sort of circle-y thing from the first few minutes of episode 1. I don't know if it has a meaning or will have a meaning.
I've always assumed...
I did like the pyrotechnics. I thought that was cool.
Yeah, I've always assumed that because the Children of the Forest actually created the Night King, that a lot of his imagery, because we saw it there too. So a lot of his imagery is sort of sacred geometry that probably comes from Children of the Forest, because that's why we have those spirals in the mines over in Dragonstone. I believe because that was a sacred Children of the Forest area, and then also north of the Wall with the Three-Eyed Raven. And I was listening to this podcast that they had this amazing critique on the spirituality of the Song of Ice and Fire universe and how it shows up in different ways. But spirals and concentric circles have been part of sacred geometry of various cultures here on Earth. But it makes sense that to me, that's what I see when I saw it, is that is the Song of Ice and Fire planet's sort of sacred geometry. We have the Fibonacci spiral, but this is their spiral, which I thought was cool. And it was an interesting throwback to earlier seasons, because it has been seasons since we've seen the White Walkers do something creepy like that. They were very ominous in the beginning, and then they became very adversarial with a war that you're fighting, and then they had a dragon by the end of it. And so much of this episode felt like going back to the roots and mirroring episode 1 of you don't even get to see White Walkers, you see what they leave behind to sort of ratchet up the tension and the threat that they pose.
That's so true. And it's making me think we talk about the White Walkers as a metaphor for climate change, how everybody's fighting the Game of Thrones while and fighting amongst themselves while the actual climate change is crisis is marching forward. If that design to me looks like what we here consider a sun symbol. So are they seeking out and trying to create warmth that they're incapable of generating on their own? Is that why they're seeking their expansionism?
I mean, I don't know on the show. In the books, it's very much the opposite. That they hate all warmth. That they are basically anything with warm blood, not just humans, right? Because they turn bears into undead, and they turn horses, and it's anything that's warm. I guess they're okay with lizards.
I wonder then if it's a desecration then, that they take the sun symbol that might have come from the Children of the Forest as being warmth and abundance, and they're we're gonna shit all over this and turn it into something dark and evil by putting cold dead body parts on it.
Yeah, like Monty Burns, they too have longed to destroy the sun.
Yes. Yes, oh my god. Well, I don't want to go too far without talking about the fact that this is the episode where it finally gets told to Jon that R plus L equals J, as the fans used to say. I love, and this was something that everybody was pointing out on Twitter as well, that when Ned says, I'll tell you about your mother when I see you next. Then, of course, he dies before they can actually see each other again. But Jon is down in the crypts, connecting with his father in spirit when Sam goes down to tell him what his true parentage. I'm sad that Jon doesn't understand that his dad lying to him when he was younger was like... Where Ned fucked up was not telling Jon when Jon came of age. But Jon definitely should not have known that as a small child, where he could have accidentally babbled it to somebody and gotten his ass killed. So I don't know. Like
Ned fell prey to the "I'll tell you next time we meet" curse of death.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And also, I think
that's really how we should have known he was going to die. Actually, is
exactly.
Oh, absolutely. And like same thing with Benjen. It's just like universally, if you have something to say, if you want to live, you tell someone right away.
Yeah,
let nothing fester.
It probably was never safe to tell Jon as long as Robert Baratheon was alive. But that, like, once Robert Baratheon was dead, finally, because he would have taken out any other sort of claim on his throne. And the Lannisters and all those other people in Season 1 were taking out all of Baratheon's bastard children. So, like, it's been safe since Robert died to tell Jon, but unfortunately Ned didn't make it that much longer after Robert died. But yeah, it's like, it is kind of fucked up that Ned didn't tell Jon, and Jon has, like, internalized being a bastard in so many different ways. That like moved him all throughout this whole time, and now for him to learn that it's a lie. But it also, the thing that I enjoy that really colored this whole thing was Sam and his interaction with Daenerys, that he was like so filled with joy and happiness, and respect to meet her, but then found out that she killed his father and his brother, and in that moment of grief is when he's telling Jon this. I thought was like super interesting. I did not see that coming. Like, we all know Jon is going to find out, but how? Like, I always suspected Bran would tell him in his very stoner, philosophical, three-eyed raven way.
I love how that became a meme.
Yeah. It's so accurate,
with Sam, I mean, the actor John Bradley was such an amazing job. It's like, your abusive dad and not abusive brother are both dead. It's like processing, I hope Sam has the intelligence at least to be like, no, my father really is a piece of shit and abusive, but my brother
is on the Umbrella Academy.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
He is.
Okay, interesting. But, my brother is, in the book, it's different, but, like, in the show, his brother, there's nothing in particularly, like, just, I don't know, it was a good bit of acting and and I believe that he really brought it to Jon in that moment to say, like, now I'm showing you the complexity of the situation and asking you to think about how you would handle it differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because they have different leadership styles, Daenerys and Jon. Like, Jon is very self-sacrificing. I would say politely that Daenerys is more of like a visionary leader.
Slightly messianic, one might even say.
Yeah. I feel like as a Dothraki speaker, I'm already like contractually obligated to root for Daenerys, so I'm always just finding rose-colored glasses of which to look at her.
Well, I don't mean messianic in a bad way. I mean literally, like, her life is entwined with prophecy. You know, she was visited by 3 wise men in a desert. Like, she has seen the future. She has walked into fire and come out not dead. Like, if anything, it's slightly weird that, like, Jon is so fucking blasé about, you died and came back from the dead. This should be profoundly transformative to your entire, like, psyche.
Yeah, like it is for Benrick, right? Who's gone through all that, or Beric, right? Beric, yeah. And there's almost a piece of that I also thought was interesting in this episode. Jon Snow and Arya talking at the Weirwood Tree when she was like, how did you survive? And he said, I didn't, but neither one of them wanted to pick it up. And I think that, like, Arya probably didn't want to carry that conversation because then she has to talk about a lot of the stuff that she did. Like, when he asked if she ever used needle, and she's like, once or twice. And we're like, we're kind of like, bitch, please. Like, we've seen you murder whole tons of people now and root for you while you're doing it. But there's still this, like, shame that she has. Because it's interesting. She's becoming and has always been one of my favorite characters. but she's so much more interesting to watch now in these later seasons because she wants to be this grown sort of warrior, but she's not quite there yet. I'm hoping she gets there because I'm hoping that she takes out Cersei Lannister because I cannot stand Cersei, and I think Arya deserves to be the one to kill her. But that might be like a whole other podcast episode.
I mean, she's not because of I don't know. I guess she could be the younger sibling who kills her, but I still feel like it's probably going to be, her action. I don't know. Maybe she's the younger sibling who kills. No, I don't want to litigate too much over prophecies specific to the book, but
yeah, we'll see how it goes.
I clearly want to, but I'm not going to do that right now. But speaking of the books, hey, the Golden Company arrived.
Yes. Harry Strickland, of all the characters who I didn't think would make it into the show, Harry Homeless Strickland is there, and he's just as much a smarmy, useless git. Although, it's funny, the show version of him is so much worse at logistics than the book version. The book version got the elephants. He brought the elephants. He was very careful to bring the elephants. But, part of me thinks, they probably just didn't have room in the CGI budget. They were busily reenacting How to Train Your Dragon and, priorities.
Yeah, but it's the most expensive show in the world in history thus far.
I don't blame them for a moment.
You don't have a few more for elephants, but, okay.
I just think it's funny that you could have just not mentioned the elephants at all, but
I thought it was a fun exchange though. I did her having this particular expectation and him explaining why it wouldn't be really meetable rather. But it also sort of shows up I like when he comes and I haven't watched it again, but he's got a specific accent that is not the same accent as everybody else on the show. So I like the whole, he's from a different culture and his forefathers are not, right? His forefathers are from Westeros, but he himself is from Essos. And so I sort of appreciated that, that touch of the different sort of cultural moment of him coming in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I feel like they've done that because, who is it? Back in season 1, Illyrio, who teaches Arya the water dancing, sword fighting movement, he also has his own kind of, distinct accent, and they, Shay also has her own. I really like the way that the show has done accents, in terms of marking people who are from further away distances. Because, and even the Dornish don't quite speak the same as the rest of the Westerosi.
Yes, which is something they do better in the books, by the way. Better than in the books, by the way. Because Martin doesn't really go in for, phonetic transcription of people's dialect.
Yeah, I know. As the linguistics nerd, I'm pretty sad about it.
Yes. Well, this is what happens when, people write fantasy books who aren't Oxford linguistics dons.
I was going to say, this is also, look, the other option is he could have gone full on Chris Claremont with it, which, I just don't need that much poorly
faith in Bagora.
No. So that's the thing that was exciting for me. But of course, the most exciting thing of all, it's not Cersei's poor decisions, it's riding a dragon. Because here we got to see Jon riding a dragon. The fact, we knew that this would be possible, that he would be one of the dragon riders, but he did take to it quite fast. And in the books, the dragons have saddles, and in this saddle-free TV show environment, I'm not this does not work. This does not work.
Yeah,
this is not possible. You have nothing to hold on to.
Dangerous on the set. Kit Harington was talking about he almost lost a testicle when they were shooting that scene.
Yeah, he should probably wear a cup.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a little late now because the show's in the can. But
well, he'll learn for future appearances in action shows.
That's right. It'll be in his writer. He's like, look, you need to make sure that this is safety proofed.
So, what did you all think of that sequence? The riding the dragon and the making out.
I loved it. It was a little bit long though, but it was, to me, it's necessary for Jon's character for him to accept the truth later. That he actually is a Targaryen. That would be harder for him if he hadn't ridden a dragon.
Yeah, I thought it was very visually lovely. I mean, the parallel to Ygritte was very clear.
Yes.
really trying to make it like obvious, like this is the relationship. Come on. I did think it was interesting, speaking of the, going back a little bit to the R+L=J thing, that like he seems, and this has to do with the way that the show has handled incest really strangely in the past couple seasons. Like he seems way more worried about the fact that like he's technically, the Targaryen male heir than he is about the fact that like she's his aunt.
I don't think I think that's legitimate. For the record, I think within the world of the show that makes sense, to be honest.
I mean,
like, they're not
in the
married.
world of the show. Yes, but like incest as a taboo in the world has like led to civil wars. Mm-hmm. People have murdered to protect that secret. And if it's like everyone's completely blasé about it and it's all about we don't choose who we love, I feel like it then becomes harder to explain why Bran Stark got thrown out a window.
But this is different. This is inadvertent. This is with someone who he never met before in his life, and they're Targaryens. Like,
it's what's it called? Genetic attraction.
Because because incest was not that big of a deal in ancient Westeros with Targaryen kings and queens and siblings marrying each other. The real incest taboo started sort of with the Lannisters because they're not Targaryens, right? Like,
I would quibble with that.
Okay.
There was this whole religious civil war called the Revolt of the Faithful, where like you had the High Septon like openly preaching from the pulpit that, the Targaryens were abominations in the eyes of the gods, and like tens and tens of thousands of people were killed. It has been, and the way that was resolved historically was that, like, literally they had something written within the doctrine of the Seven called the Doctrine of Exceptionalism, where the Targaryens are exceptional. They are, halfway between gods and men, and look at, their eyes and their hair color, and it's so pretty and different. And, like, that was part of the kind of reigning cultural ideology of Westeros, but it's like part of the reason why we're supposed to view, in some ways, like Cersei and Jaime's relationship as like the ultimate expression of Lannister arrogance, that they think that they too are above the rules.
Mm-hmm. I definitely see that. It is, yeah, and it's also really weird that like, yeah, I'm of both minds on it, because like, I think eventually Jon is, like, with all the realization that he's a Targaryen, is going to hit him that he has now already slept with his aunt. But, like, yeah, I wonder how much of the Targaryen kind of culture, because even Daenerys and her older brother before he was dead, that was also really weird and incestuous, but not, like, consummated, thank goodness, but really sort of weird. So I feel like Daenerys probably would have no problem accepting Jon as a Targaryen if it weren't for the fact that his Targaryen ancestry actually gives him a greater claim to the throne than hers.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. I really think that it is more of a political problem, honestly. Like, yeah. I think that the other people will, like, if their political marriage needs to exist, then people will, like, live with, like, the incest and not even raise an eyebrow, especially because they have the Targaryen out for explaining it. Mm-hmm. And, like, and on a person-to-person level, again, this is someone who they did not grow up with, and they're the same age as each other. Like, it's just not, this isn't like, I hate to say it, this isn't a normal case of someone sleeping with their aunt, but, like, it's really not a normal case of someone sleeping with their aunt. Like, they don't even look alike. Like, it's not, I don't know. Yeah. But speaking of people making decisions about sex, so Cersei, at first, when she's like, okay, screw it, I'm going to sleep with the shady pirate dude, I was like, why? And then I was like, oh, right, you're already pregnant, and you need to have some plausible person to be the father of your child who isn't your brother. So
yeah,
okay.
that's going to go over a lot better,
Yeah,
people love the idea of a bastard being the heir to the throne that, she already... This is the thing that, like, drove me a little bit crazy about last season, is, like, she, by all of the political, rules that, like, Westeros is operated under, she's got no claim to the throne. Now, she's also managed to, like, murder the Pope, effectively. there should be political, cultural consequences. Like, maybe they're not gonna, like, rise up against her because they've, she just murdered lots and lots and lots of people and she now has a big army. But, like, you'd think that people would be running away because she's cursed in the eyes of the gods or something.
Yeah. That, like, when she blew up the Sept of the Baelor, so it's not just the High Sparrow, it's, like, so many other highborn people that I feel like probably the people of King's Landing are like, oh, we can't fuck with Cersei because who knows what she'll do. She'll burn this whole city down. But I don't think that would extend to her offspring at all. Like, I think that, like, the smartest political move that Cersei ever did was blow up the Sept of Baelor. And if you, like, watch the shows, because, like, my boyfriend wasn't into Game of Thrones recently, and we watched the whole thing in preparation of Season 8, which was a great mental exercise. But Cersei makes really dumb decisions. And
pretty much constantly.
Pretty much constantly. And I don't foresee this, like, faking Euron, like, to be the baby daddy is going to work out for her at all, because, like, it just doesn't seem to make much political sense that, like, any of her children, two of whom were king and didn't make it for that long, like, that any of her future children are going to have a claim on the throne. I feel like if Cersei were to die, like, it would just be a big old free-for-all like it was in Season 2, like, now, because Robert Baratheon didn't have that much of a claim to the throne either because he wasn't a Targaryen. But this is me rambling. Sorry.
No, it's not. This is totally on point, so don't worry about it. I do want to make sure we take a minute to also just sort of talk about a big theme of the episode series, and then I want to go into some of our listener questions. So, I was just constantly having moments watching this episode, seeing, like, oh, everybody in charge is a child. Like, the littlest Umber is, like, a tiny, tiny child. You've got Lyanna Mormont being a child. You have Sansa, being a very experienced and competent, but pretty much a child. Like, everybody involved in leadership at this point is a kid, except for Cersei. And Cersei, of course, is acting like a petulant child, but that's a different story. It really feels like this is this big generational cataclysmic moment where one generation of Westerosi leadership was wiped out and another one is coming into power. And maybe this younger generation is the one that will finally reckon with the climate apocalypse that's coming. Ba-da-bum, Power Shift Network.
I love that as a metaphor. I love that as a metaphor. Wouldn't it be amazing if that is the final thematic push that the show makes, is like kick out all the old people rulers and put some youth in there so that we could deal with climate change? That would be probably one of the better ways the show could end. But will it happen in our world? Because it seems to be happening in Westeros. But whether or not it could happen in the United States,
that's up to you, dear listeners.
Yeah.
But that's also the other one of all the reunions. I loved all of them, and it's not even a reunion because I don't think Jorah has ever met Lyanna. But I was like, man, I want those two characters to be in a scene because Lyanna does not hold back.
Yeah, I feel like that would be a very short bit about, like, oh, yeah, you're the guy who sold people to slavers.
Mm-hmm. And disgraced the whole family.
And then you ran away. Yeah, disgraced our family.
But Lyanna would not even be in power if Jorah hadn't been exiled and everything, that's right? True. So, like, there's a weird interdependence. And then it made me think, even thinking this idea thematically about youth leadership versus establishment or older leadership, Jorah has so much of his leadership is based on this, like, unrequited, unfailing love for Daenerys, right? And specifically her, maybe more of the Masonic version of her, but definitely her because he's in love with her. And Lyanna is really just ruled so much by her own values. She's like, we are the North, I am Bear Island, I am in charge of stewarding my people, and where she's coming from. And that enables her to have so much fight and so much fire within her and to be so outspoken, because Jorah's not necessarily an outspoken person. He's like a powerful ally to have, but he's sort of like pushed by his own self-interest as opposed to a collective self-interest. So it'd be really interesting to see those characters interact, but I think that those characters actually embody this thematic idea we have of who holds power and what kind of power they hold. Like the collective power, the younger power, or like the older power, the self-interested power?
Right on. I want to pivot to some listener questions. I'm going to start with the smaller ones and then get to the one that I worry could take up 30 hours. So the smaller one is, are the kids wargs in the TV show? It's a really big thing that's played up in the book, and I just don't really have... Yeah, like, are they wargs in the TV show? I guess we have a moment where we sort of see that Jon is, but what's going on with that?
I would say technically, but not thematically.
Right.
I mean, you know, I'm thinking back to it, right? Jon is the only one who still has his wolf with him, although he is at this point something of an absent wolf father. You know, I think this is one of those things where, like, something that was really important and meaningful in the books was an unfortunate victim of the reality that, like, animal handling is really complicated. And so, you know, they kind of took their opportunity to, you know, like, close off that part of the story as quickly as they could. I don't think, for example, that, like, when Arya reunites with Nymeria in the books, that she's just going to be like, okay, you stay here, I'm going to leave. Like, I don't think that at all is what's going to happen.
Yeah, I don't have much perspective on this because I'm still in the first book, reading the books. I'm still kind of struggling through that. But I wonder though, like, if it takes away, if all of the Stark kids are wargs and they can, like, sort of use that ability at hand. Like, I'm thinking of the whole time Sansa has been in King's Landing and whatnot, and that would be super helpful for her. But would it take away from the realism of the political dynamics to introduce yet another supernatural thing?
So they'll kind of explain this a little bit more in the books. There's, like, it's not so much that, like, you can instantly tap into it. Whether you have a chance to form a connection to your wolf is significant.
Okay.
She never had the opportunity because...
Yeah, got it.
Because, yeah. Next question. Arya has a Valyrian steel dagger that she clearly chose not to mention to Jon. Why is she playing that one close to the chest? And I'll add, what was the design that she wanted to have Gendry forge for her? Was that something out of Dragonglass?
Yes. Which, by the way, I checked. Yes, it is technically possible to melt down and forge obsidian.
Okay.
It's extremely difficult. And, like, I honestly think going the Aztec route would be far more efficient. Where you just, you know, set teeth of obsidian into, you know, handles and things like that.
Mm-hmm. And just have, like, amazing, sharp, toothy clubs and spears.
Exactly, yeah. And arrowheads and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, they showed them making what looked like arrowheads, and I was like, interesting choice, but now that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, back to listener question. What's that about?
I wonder, because Arya, so she doesn't tell him about the Valyrian steel, but she also doesn't tell Jon about, like, how much of a killer she is now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she didn't, after he said, I didn't survive, didn't then say, cool, I worked in a death cult.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I would have said personally.
Yeah, and she's choosing to keep all of that really close to her chest, which I think is a smart move because, like, well, A, it might be taboo in Westerosi culture anyway, but B, it's like there's so much more in her arsenal to use to, like, you know, take people off her list. But that's the thing that I wonder, does Arya even still care about her list? We haven't heard about it in a while.
It's very true.
Well, there's not a lot of people left on the list.
Except for the Hound. And Cersei.
Yeah, I feel like the Hound, she kind of, like,
She's
had
killed him
her
already.
decision. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You know. But I think, like, one of the things I've just seen lots of fans talking about is, like, oh, everyone's being catty to everyone, and, like, trying to play up the different tensions between, predominantly the tensions between the Stark kids and Daenerys. And I think, like, these are relationships that are really there's like a political dynamic to all of them, and I understand the desire to sort of read it as like, oh, why does this show have to go and make the girls be catty at each other? And it's like, they're actually not. They're having a political dispute.
Yeah.
We are so trained to look at young, beautiful women being angry at each other as being catty, petty stuff, that young, beautiful women having a political dispute with each other, like, does not compute in the eyes of viewers. But, like, actually, no, like, Dany and Sansa, for example, are in a political dispute. They're not just like, my hair looks better than yours.
Yeah, or like, I'm jealous of your brother or whatever, yeah.
Yeah, no. And, like, people have been trying to say, like, well, like, acting like they would just be, like, see each other and go, like, girl power. It's like, that's not how politics work. And it speaks to the intelligence and complexity of both characters that's not their only metric for understanding each other either.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would help if they present the politics in a little bit more ideological and less personal
way
tones, and make some, like, be okay with complexity and ambiguity. Like, one of the things that I found kind of interesting, have found kind of interesting for a while, is, like, Sansa being the, like, okay, northern nationalism, hoorah! And I'm like, you, like, rule an army of Valemen that you brought, that were brought to the north, and, like, you direct them. There is some ambiguity in this position, or at least should be. Why not have that conversation out? Or, if, you know what I'm saying? Like, it seems like everyone sort of is very sort of one-dimensional is unfair, but, like, there's not a lot of nuance in any one person's political position.
And yeah, I think that if they had decided to make a full 10-episode season, there could be more time for that.
Yeah.
I think that the showrunners have both shot themselves in the foot and have an amazing opportunity, because they keep, like, last season wasn't 10 episodes either, and this one is only going to be 6, so they don't have enough time. But it also makes me question, I've had this in season 5 and season 6 and season 7 of, like, are the showrunners going to pull off what they're attempting to do and, like, ending this story in a really great way? Like, so many TV shows have been great and then completely failed the landing. And it's not always, a guarantee that you're going to make it. And I think one of the problems is they are sort of losing, as so many of these storylines converge, they're losing the nuanced political dynamics that are happening all around them that made the show so great in its earlier seasons. But now they have to fight climate change, so now, which is funny, because in real life, the threat of climate change has not sort of reduced our political nuance in any way. In fact, it's only sort of, like, made it worse. So maybe we're in, like, season 3, United States Congress of season 3 of Game of Thrones, where, like, all of our complexities are just making us ignore the problem.
Wow.
That is that is something to think about.
Our final question was, why the Sansa haters? And I feel like that's a question which has been covered a lot already. So, I mean, obviously the short version is, like, sexism, but, like, I don't know if folks want to weigh in beyond the standard because sexism answer.
Yeah. I mean, it's sexism, it's shipping, it's the way that she particularly performs gender. I mean, especially, like, versus Arya, who, like, the tomboy is a slightly, I mean, it seems strange to say this, but, like, it's a slightly easier role to play with some audiences.
Yeah, if you're dealing with like a fantasy audience where like, I mean, and this show is so mainstream that it's not even like the case anymore. But like, if you have a nerd audience, that tomboy character is going to be the one that they're going to want to cheer for. Mm-hmm. The show is beyond a nerd audience now, but like, it's still sort of written into and also just sort of anybody who is embracing masculine or culturally constructed ideals of what a masculine hobby or pastime is going to be seen as more valid.
Yeah.
And one of the amazing things that the show does is deconstruct all of that. So anybody who's managed to read these books and not leave understanding the value of both Arya and Sansa is really not doing a good job of reading.
Yeah, I think too, because there's interesting things, because like, you know, Sansa is more of like, you know, delving into the more feminine parts of power and like, you know, being able to navigate like the court and all that different stuff. But Daenerys also is like kind of a hyper feminized figure too, who's also super powerful. I think that for some people, once a character gets labeled as a victim, or you see a character get victimized, it's like some people who lack empathy, it's hard to redeem that character in front of their eyes again. Which is sexism, which is like laziness and like a lack of intellectual curiosity that like, I feel like it's mostly sexism that people hate Sansa, but I think some of it was that, like, in earlier seasons, you saw her in a really powerless position, and she's no longer in that now, and some, you know, less intellectually curious people don't know how to reckon with that, and don't know how to see someone go from victim to survivor.
That is such a good point, and a much more elegant and explanatory way than me just saying sexism, because that's also sexism, but you've spelled it out in a much better way than I have by just tossing it aside. Thank you both. That was fabulous.
Thank you.
So, well, thank you all for joining me. I would love to at least do this again maybe at the finale.
Yes.
I think that we can arrange that.
Excellent, excellent. And to our listeners, if you have other questions, feel free to, you know, drop them in the Twitter. I'm on Twitter at ELANA_Brooklyn. That's Elana_Brooklyn. This podcast is brought to you by Graphic Policy Radio. Do either of you guys have any Game of Thrones related media appearances coming up that you know of?
So I have at least one other podcast that I've been invited on to. This is going to get really nerdy. Debate the which army is better, the Unsullied or the 300 Spartans. So if you really want to get into the like really, you know, would Superman beat Batman or vice versa of fantasy and history? Come join me for that.
That sounds fun. So I should hopefully be appearing in a Refinery 29 article that's going to happen sometime this month, like a human interest piece profiling all 3 or 4 of us Dothraki speakers who are currently active in the world, who aren't David J. Peterson, although he was also interviewed for this project as well. So I'm super excited about that. And yeah, when that comes out, I'll throw it on all of my different social medias and tag Alana. And I'm excited for like the world to get to see a little bit more of what the Dothraki community looks like in the real world and like who we are, because we are just like super big nerds who happen to nerd out about the exact same thing.
So Tihi, where can our listeners find your work online?
You can find my work online. You can buy my book, Dark Corners. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever you buy books, online or in person. Dark Corners by Reuben Tihi Hayslett. You can find me on Facebook mostly, because that's the social media I check the most often. And my name is Tihi which is Dothraki for Reuben. And you can find me on Facebook there.
Awesome. And Stephen, you have like the most active, badass Game of Thrones Tumblr, so
sure
everybody's following Race for the Iron Throne already, but
yes, and also my WordPress site, which is where which is also Race for the Iron Throne, which is where you can find like my episode recaps and my essays, and you know, pretty much it's where, and I do Tumblr roundup, so it's like all of my content eventually ends up there. So check that out too.
It's a tremendous resource for fans,
Thank you.
especially if you want to understand the books on a deeper level. So thank you all for joining me. And like we say at Graphic Policy, keep it geeky. Oh, Tihi, how do you say keep it geeky in Dothraki?
Dothraki don't have a word for geeky. I'm gonna say off the let's just say Kovaras Awaka. Yeah, Kovas Awaka Kishi. Keep our spirit.
I love
Okay,
it.
nice.
Talk to y'all soon. Bye.
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 Hey, thanks for watching the previous video from Graphic Policy Television. Just by watching, you help support our site. Thank you so much. Now, if you're watching these videos, you probably care about geeky things like movies, television, comic books, toys, games, video games, you name it. You can go and subscribe right now to our YouTube channel to stay in touch and catch all the new videos, or check out our website at graphicpolicy.com. There's a nice link on this end of the video. But as always, thank you for watching. Keep on rocking and keep it geeky.